Good morning, everybody. As the 1800s progressed, there was growing interest in how to communicate with the deaf. And it was on this date in 1876, March 10, that an inventor tried out a machine for communicating with the deaf. That inventor, Alexander Graham Bell. His invention, the telephone. Remember the tin can telephones when we were little, the styrofoam cups with the string? Well, people actually used those a long time ago. Speaking trumpets were also in use. You may recall pictures of older people with ear trumpets so they can hear. Well, our story is about Alexander Graham Bell. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Here's his birthplace. Eventually, the family moved to North America. And when he was young, his mother started going deaf and she became deaf. So he became very interested in how to communicate with deaf people. And his dad taught elocution. Here's a chart that shows the difference between elocution and speech. But elocution has to do with, are you pronouncing words clearly and so people can understand. When Alexander Graham Bell was little, his dad brought him to see an automaton, a human head that was powered by a bellows that shot air through a made-up larynx, and the head actually spoke. That fascinated Bell. So in his 20s, the family moved to North America. This is a school for deaf people in Boston, where Alexander Graham Bell worked for a while. And it was while he was here he met Helen Keller, pictured here. So Boston was one of the centers of study on how to communicate with the deaf. And over at BU, here's a picture of one of the early Boston University buildings. Alexander Graham Bell was actually on the faculty. So it was an exciting place to be for that study. Now, the telegraph had been around for a long time. And by the time we get to our story, people were wondering about, can you send the human voice over electric wires, not just tapping like on a telegraph key. So here's Antonio Meucci. He was Italian, lived in the early to mid 1800s. Some credit him with inventing the telephone, or at least something like a telephone. And his invention looked something like this. I can't really explain it very well, but the idea was if you held these things up, you could communicate with each other. So perhaps an early version of the telephone. But the big story is with Elisha Gray on the left. He and Bell were working on similar things. This is a big story. You may want to check it out sometime. But one version is who got to the patent office first. And Alexander Graham Bell got the mother patent. Not quite sure his was exactly the same as Gray's, and this is kind of what that first telephone looked like. There were lots of different models that he used, but the idea was how to communicate with deaf people. He actually married a deaf person too. So here's a picture of him speaking into the telephone, and our event is this date where he said, "Watson, come here, I need you." This is the old AT&T building in Boston. It's not owned by them anymore, but if you go in the front door and turn right, you would see Bell's office in Boston where he worked on the telephone. It was taken apart, put back together inside that building, and that was something you could see for a while. You can't anymore. He started AT&T. And notice the second T is telegraph, so American Telephone and Telegraph. So those were co-equal at the beginning, but eventually the telephone took off, and there were all kinds of private telephone companies. So here you see all these different telephone lines, and it was pretty confusing. So early on in the 1900s, AT&T asked the federal government to have a monopoly. They said it would be easier for everybody, and that's what happened. So those of us of a certain age remember when there was just one kind of telephone, and it was AT&T. But technology changed, and in the early 80s, the federal government broke up the monopoly. And here's a chart of, in the mid-80s, there were all these, what they called the baby bells, but since then they've consolidated, and AT&T and Verizon are still around, but they're sort of that mother AT&T. but all from a man who was curious about communicating with the deaf.